The cargo vessel drifted through the black stretch of space with its engines humming low, carrying crates of minerals from the outer mining stations. Daniel sat in the pilot's chair, his eyes half on the blinking navigation panel and half on the stars that floated in the void ahead. The route was long and quiet, and he had already fallen into the rhythm of long-haul travel. When the calm broke, the ship's sensor gave a sharp alarm, and the screen lit with a signal of distress. It was faint and old-fashioned, the kind used in emergencies when everything else had failed. Daniel leaned forward, reading the coordinates. The location was not far, just a small detour into a cluster of asteroid fragments, the kind of place ships avoided because of the drifting rocks and the raider activity in the shadows. But something in the short, clipped signal carried urgency, a voice repeating the same phrase in a language he did not know. He adjusted the course, feeling the familiar pull of risk and responsibility deep inside his chest. He had been a cargo runner for years and knew better than to get involved in trouble out here, but he had also seen too many wrecks where no one had bothered to help. The asteroid field swallowed his ship in darkness and motion, huge pieces of stone tumbling slowly like frozen giants turning in their sleep ahead. The source of the signal came into view, a small alien vessel marked with bright colors and patterns, strange symbols painted along the hull. The ship was broken in two, with fire flickering from the main body, the other half tumbling away into the void. Daniel scanned quickly, picking up several smaller ships circling the wreck. They were armed raiders tearing into the metal like vultures. Daniel gritted his teeth and powered the thrusters forward. His cargo ship was not built for combat, but it had enough shielding to take a few hits. He brought the forward lights on, revealing himself to the scavengers and sending a tight beam transmission, ordering them to break away. The response came in the form of plasma fire streaking across his shields. The impact rattled the hull. He muttered under his breath and swung the ship to block their path to the wreck while powering up the magnetic clamps on his docking arm. Through the cracked hull of the alien vessel he could see movement, a figure staggering through smoke, clutching something in their arms. Without thinking, Daniel engaged the manual boarding procedure, leaping from his own hatch into the twisted remains of the alien ship. Heat and smoke stung his eyes, but he pushed forward over broken panels and tangled wires until he found her, an alien woman, her skin a faint silver tone, her eyes deep and bright with fear. She was bleeding from a gash along her side, yet when she saw him, she froze as though unsure whether he was an enemy, lifted his hands slowly, speaking in calm tones. She would not understand the words, but she might hear the meaning in his voice. She swayed, then collapsed forward, and Daniel caught her pulling her arm over his shoulder. She was lighter than he expected, but her breathing was heavy. The raiders had seen him now and were trying to block his way back to the hatch. His hand went to the side holster and he fired a quick burst from his old projectile weapon, not meant for space combat, but enough to scatter them in the narrow passage. The shots cracked through the smoky air, and the raiders fell back. Daniel half carried, half dragged her to the docking hatch, sealing it behind them. Just as another blast shook the hull of the wreck, he hit the release. The clamps let go, and his ship pulled away, engines roaring to life as he steered hard through the asteroid. Debris plasma bolts streaked after them, but the rocks provided cover, and soon the enemy ships faded from the radar, leaving only the hum of the engines and the shallow sound of the woman's breathing. Laid her gently on the medical cot in the small bay of his freighter. The med scanner flickered to life, running through her vitals. She had burns and blood loss, but nothing the med kit could not handle. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a long moment, she stared at him with an intensity that made him feel as though she could see more than just his face. She reached up and caught his hand, holding it firmly, as though anchoring herself in the unfamiliar room. Her voice was soft and musical, speaking words he could not understand, but heavy with emotion and meaning. Daniel tried to reassure her, telling her she was safe, that the raiders were gone. She did not let go. The med unit beeped, showing her condition stabilizing but still critical. She remained awake, watching his every movement, her grip unbroken. Daniel sat beside the cot as the ship continued toward the nearest safe port, and wondered about the strange events that had just unfolded. He had rescued people before in his life, but none had held his hand like this, as though refusing to release him. As though some silent thread had been tied between them in the heat of danger, the hum of the ship filled the silence. And in that stillness he could not shake the feeling that the rescue was only the beginning of something far larger than he had imagined. Daniel kept the ship steady on its course, the faint glow of the stars slipping past the viewports, while the alien woman lay resting in the medbay, her silver-toned skin catching the light of the console in soft ripples. He had learned her name from the small translation pad clipped to her belt, Lyra. It was the only word in her language the device could repeat clearly. He found himself saying it once quietly, and she opened her eyes at the sound, her gaze holding his, as though she wanted to measure the weight of the human who had pulled her from fire and smoke. She tried to speak, but the words were a flowing melody he could not understand. He placed the translator between them and asked if she could try again. The device flickered for a moment before giving a halting translation. "You saved my life." Her voice through the translator sounded almost fragile, yet there was a firmness underneath, a tone of certainty. She spoke again, and the translation came, "You are my bondmate now." Daniel blinked, unsure he had heard correctly. The device was old and imperfect, but her steady gaze told him she meant every word he asked. Slowly what that meant, and the answer came in pieces. Her people had a law older than memory. If someone saved your life, you must bind your fate to theirs to protect and honor them until death. Daniel tried to explain that in human culture, gratitude did not mean you had to live with the person forever, but the translator twisted his meaning, and she frowned. As though his refusal would be unthinkable, she reached for his hand again, that same grip from the moment in the wreck, tight and warm. She did not let go for the rest of the flight, even when she closed her eyes and drifted into uneasy sleep. When they reached the orbital port above a trade world, the local officials were curious about the passenger. Daniel brought in a tall officer with scaled skin, the color of rust, inspected her wounds, and checked her identity, his eyes widening when he realized who she was. He pulled Daniel aside, speaking in low tones through the common language. "She is the daughter of a high counselor," he said. "Her life carries weight. If you have accepted her bond, you must understand it is more than tradition. It is law." Daniel laughed lightly, saying he had not agreed to anything, but the officer's expression did not change. His voice dropped lower. "You cannot refuse the bond without causing offense to her people, and to refuse means danger, not just for you but for anyone you deal with." Daniel returned to the ship with the officer's warning echoing in his thoughts. Lyra was standing in the narrow hall of the freighter, looking out at the station through the viewport. She seemed restless, her posture alert, her eyes scanning the movement of ships outside. When she noticed him, she stepped closer and said something quietly. The translator worked again. "They will come for me again. I must stay with you." He asked who they were, but she only shook her head and said enemies, her voice hard like stone. Over the next 2 days, he noticed how she moved through the ship with silent steps, always aware of the exits and the angles of approach. When they stopped at small outposts to unload cargo, she walked beside him as though guarding him instead of the other way around. Some traders whispered at her presence, giving Daniel strange looks when they thought he could not see. One old miner leaned toward him and said, "Careful, boy, once you carry a bond, you carry it for life." Daniel brushed it off, but a small unease settled in the back of his mind. One night while the ship cruised in deep space, Lyra joined him in the cockpit, her silver skin reflecting the dim console lights. She sat in the co-pilot seat without asking permission, and spoke again through the translator. "When I was on my ship before the attack, I was returning from the council. I refused an alliance that would have given power to those I do not trust. They hired raiders to silence me." Daniel listened quietly as she told him her story in fragments, her words slow as the translator struggled with her language, each sentence building a clearer picture. Her enemies were not pirates at random. They were connected to her own people, and they would not stop until she was dead. He realized then that By pulling her from that wreck, he had stepped into something far more dangerous than a simple rescue. The bond she claimed was not only about tradition, it was about survival, hers. And now perhaps his as well. He sat back in the pilot's chair, staring at the endless stretch of stars outside the viewport, wondering what kind of future lay ahead with an alien warrior at his side, and a cultural law that had just made him her mate. In the eyes of her people, days turned into a strange rhythm aboard the freighter. As Daniel adjusted to life with Lyra constantly at his side, she moved through the narrow halls with the quiet precision of someone trained to be alert every moment. Her presence changed the way the ship felt. She inspected every hatch and every storage compartment, as though expecting danger to step out at any second. Daniel had been alone for so long that the simple act of sharing his space felt unusual. He found himself setting an extra cup of coffee on the console, without thinking, only to remember that she preferred a thick, dark drink from her own ration packs with a scent like burning spice. They spoke more each day through the translator, though the device sometimes twisted meanings into strange shapes. She would try to teach him simple words in her language and laugh softly when he got the sounds wrong. Her laughter was rare and quick, but it made the air between them lighter. Still, there was an undercurrent of tension. Daniel was used to human customs where personal space and privacy were expected, but Lyra's culture seemed to have no such boundary. She sat close when they ate. She followed him when he worked in the engine bay. She insisted on sleeping in the same quarters, saying that to be apart in the dark was an insult to the bond. He tried to explain that humans needed space, but the translator gave the phrase as humans need distance from those they dislike, and she froze at the words, her silver eyes darkening. He quickly corrected the meaning, but she turned away, and for hours after that, she spoke little to him. He realized then how easily misunderstandings could grow between two worlds with different languages and traditions. On a supply run to a dusty trade outpost, the tension took a new turn. The station was crowded with merchants and smugglers, moving crates of goods from one dock to another. Lyra walked beside him, her posture tall and watchful, when a group of off-duty miners passed by. One of them stared too long at her and muttered something crude in the common tongue. Daniel caught the words and felt his jaw tighten before he could say anything. Lyra stepped forward in one smooth motion and sent the man sprawling with a quick twist of his arm. The others backed away, eyes wide. Daniel pulled her aside, whispering that starting fights in a public dock could get them both banned from the station. She looked at him as if he had suggested surrendering in battle later. That same day, as they carried the last cargo load back to the ship, a shadow moved in the corner of Daniel's vision. A man in a dark coat stepped from behind a crate, leveling a weapon at them. Before Daniel could react, Lyra was already between them, her blade flashing from the sheath at her side. She disarmed the attacker in a single motion. The weapon clattered to the floor. The man fled into the crowd, vanishing before station security arrived. Lyra bent to pick up the weapon, inspecting it with a cold expression. Through the translator, she said, "This is not a common gun. It is from my homeworld. They have found me again." Daniel felt the weight of her words settle over him in a way that was heavier than the cargo they hauled. He knew then that the bond was not just about strange customs and close quarters. It had already made him a target too. Later that night, while the ship drifted in deep space, he found himself checking the locks on the hatches twice. He kept the weapon she had taken from the attacker on the cockpit console, where he could reach it quickly. In the days that followed, Lyra became quieter, more focused. During training exercises, she practiced with her blade in the cargo bay, moving with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime preparing for battles. Daniel watched her once from the doorway and realized that every movement she made was calculated to protect not only herself, but the space she now shared with him. She had accepted the bond without hesitation, and no matter how alien her customs felt, she was prepared to fight for him as fiercely as she fought for herself. One evening, as they shared a meal, she told him through the translator that in her culture, the bond was forged in the moment of greatest danger and could only be broken by death. Daniel did not respond right away, his thoughts tangled between the strange reality of their situation and the quiet comfort he had begun to feel in her presence. The hum of the engines filled the silence as outside the stars drifted past like silent witnesses to a connection neither of them had chosen, yet neither of them seemed willing to break. The next weeks passed in a slow burn of tension as Daniel and Lyra traveled between trade stations delivering goods and quietly watching the shadows for movement that did not belong each time. They docked, her eyes scanned the crowd, every small sound making her hand drift toward the hilt of her blade. The quiet of space was broken one evening when a coded signal arrived on the ship's comm system. It was encrypted in a way Daniel had never seen, but Lyra recognized it instantly, her face tightening. She spoke through the translator, saying, "It is from my home. They are summoning me back." She explained that the High Council had discovered the attack on her and now demanded her return for investigation, but she suspected the same people who ordered her death would be waiting for her arrival. Daniel asked if she planned to refuse, but she shook her head. Her people believed in confronting threats directly, and running would be seen as weakness. Besides, the only way to end the danger was to stand before those who wanted her gone and strip them of their power. She told him she would understand if he left her at the nearest station before she went on alone. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, then simply said, "You know, I am coming with you." She did not smile, but her gaze softened as though she had expected nothing less. They set a course for her homeworld, a rich green planet wrapped in bands of white clouds, its cities rising like silver towers above deep rivers and wide plains. As they descended into the atmosphere, Daniel could see the vast landing platforms, each guarded by ranks of armored soldiers. The air shimmered with the heat of engines and the glint of sunlight on metal. Lyra stood beside him in the cockpit, wearing ceremonial armor polished until it caught the light, her blade strapped to her side. The moment they touched down, she walked ahead of him into the waiting crowd. They were met by a delegation of council guards who bowed to Lyra but kept their eyes on Daniel with suspicion. Their leader, a tall figure with sharp features, welcomed her formally before saying in a low voice, "The council is ready for you." Now Daniel followed them into a great hall where light streamed down through high windows onto a circle of seats carved from dark stone. The council members sat in silence, watching them approach. At the far end sat an older alien, whose eyes were cold and sharp. He spoke in their language, his tone like steel. Lyra answered with firm words that made the hall echo. Daniel could not follow the details until the translator whispered it in his ear. "She is accusing them of treachery." The older alien leaned forward, his gaze shifting to Daniel, as though weighing his worth. Lyra's voice rose as she presented evidence, recordings from her ship logs and the weapon taken from the attacker on the trade station. She placed them on a table before the council members one by one. They studied the items, murmuring to each other, some with surprise, others with anger, but Daniel noticed a few with the still calm of people whose plans were unraveling before them. When the discussion ended, the council leader announced that a trial of honor would decide the truth in Lyra's culture. This meant a public confrontation where accusations were settled not only with words, but with skill and courage. Daniel was given the choice to stand with her in the trial or step aside. She looked at him, waiting for his answer. He thought of the asteroid wreck, the burning corridors, the sound of her voice calling him bondmate. He stepped forward, saying, "I will stand with her." The crowd murmured at the sight of a human joining a challenge meant for warriors, but no one stopped him. Trial took place in an open arena where the air was filled with the roar of the crowd. Lyra faced two armed challengers who had been named as the ones responsible for her attempted death. Daniel was given a short spear and a shield unfamiliar in his hands, but he had no time to hesitate. The challengers moved fast, their strikes aimed to overwhelm, but Lyra's blade was a silver flash, deflecting blows with precision. Daniel focused on staying between her and the second challenger, using his shield to block heavy strikes. At one point, the taller opponent broke past Lyra and aimed a strike at her back. Daniel stepped in, taking the blow on his side, pain ripping through him. But he kept his footing. Lyra turned with a fierce cry, cutting the challengers. Weapon into the fight ended moments later. The crowd, erupting in a storm of sound, the council declared her victory, and the guilt of those who had sought her death, their power stripped, and their names marked in shame. Daniel staggered from the arena, his side aching, but still standing. Lyra walked beside him, her expression unreadable until they reached the quiet of the palace corridor. Then she looked at him and said through the translator, "You stood between me and the blade. You are truly my bondmate." Of palace was quiet in the hours after the trial. The echoes of the crowd's roar fading into the stillness of stone halls and high windows. Daniel walked slowly through the corridor, his side aching from the blow, but the medics had bound it tight and told him he would heal. Lyra stayed close beside him as she had from the moment he had pulled her from the wreck, her armor still marked with scratches from the fight, her eyes watching every movement around them as though danger could still be waiting in the shadows. When they reached the high balcony overlooking the city, the evening light poured over towers and gardens, turning the silver walls to gold below them. The streets were filled with people who had heard of the trial and now celebrated the victory. Daniel leaned on the railing, breathing in the cool air, the view stretching far toward the horizon. Lyra stepped forward, resting her hands on the stone, her voice quiet through the translator. "My enemies are gone. My position is secure. Now the bond can be dissolved if you wish it." Daniel turned to her, the words settling between them like a weight. He understood what she meant, and her culture saving her life had bound them together. But with the danger past, she was giving him the choice to leave, to return to the life he had before the cargo runs the long stretches of space with only the hum of engines for company. He thought of those long empty days before the distress signal, the silence without her voice, the meals eaten alone without the sound of her soft laughter when he mispronounced her words. He thought of the way she had stood with him in the arena and the way she had placed herself between him and danger again and again. He asked what would happen if he stayed, and she looked at him without the translator speaking a word. He did not understand, yet somehow felt the meaning of home. He felt a strange pull in his chest, the same one he had felt when she first held his hand in the medbay, refusing to let go. The bond was more than tradition. Now it had grown into something unspoken and real. He smiled slightly, saying, "I think I'm already home." Her expression softened, and she reached out, clasping his hand in the same firm grip as before. But now the gesture was not only about survival, it was about choice. She stepped closer, pressing her forehead lightly to his in the gesture of her people, sealing the bond for life, without any council law demanding it, without any threat forcing it. It was their decision alone. In the days that followed, Daniel began to learn more of her world. She took him through the great markets where bright fabrics fluttered in the wind and spices scented the air. She showed him the rivers that wound through the plains and the towers that caught the light like blades of crystal. In return, he showed her the freighter and the quiet joy of slipping between the stars with no destination but the next horizon. They made a life balanced between two worlds, neither fully his nor hers, but something entirely their own. And when the next distress signal came across the comms weeks later, Daniel found her already in the co-pilot seat, her hand on her blade and her eyes alight with the same fierce determination as the day they had met. They exchanged a brief glance, one that held understanding and agreement, without words, before setting a course toward the unknown. For Daniel, the bond was no longer a strange custom. It was the anchor that had pulled him from an empty, drifting life into one filled with purpose. And for Lyra, it was no longer a law, it was a choice made in battle and trust. And in the quiet moments when neither needed to speak, the stars stretched out before them, endless and bright, and together they moved toward them, the end.